A tense silence hung over the fjord. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, casting a crimson glow over the water, turning it the color of spilled blood. The wind carried the scent of an approaching storm, mixed with salt and the iodine of seaweed. But through this natural aroma, Gunnar Ironbear could already sense something else, the stench of war. He stood atop a high cliff overlooking the wide bay that served as the natural harbor for his settlement. A heavy woolen cloak draped over his broad shoulders, and at his belt hung a battle-worn sword that had seen more than its share of blood. Gunnar gazed at the horizon, counting the enemy ships. There were more than he had hoped. 23? He murmured under his breath. "What did you say, Jarl?" asked one of his men, a broad-shouldered warrior named Arn. Gunnar turned slowly. His face was like a monument carved from stone, harsh features, a strong jaw, and a dark beard streaked with silver. His eyes were deep and cold, like the winter sea. 23 longships. That means they're not just raiding us. They intend to burn the entire coast. Arn cursed loudly. The other warriors standing nearby muttered among themselves. 23 ships. This was no mere raid. This was war. "How many men do we have?" Gunnar asked. "Fewer than 200. If we gather every man capable of holding a sword, maybe 3. But most of them are fishermen and hunters," Arn replied, gripping the handle of his axe. "We won't survive," said another warrior, the grim-faced and broad-featured Snorri. Gunnar remained silent. He knew that. He had understood it the moment he saw the first silhouette of an enemy longship on the horizon. His clan had lived in prosperity, their lands were fertile, their settlement rich. And now all of it would become the spoils of invaders unless he found a way out. There was only one man who could change the course of events: Sigvard Shadowclaw. Once they had been brothers in arms. Once they had drunk mead together and marched side by side into battle. But that was long ago. Now Sigvard was an outcast, a man Gunnar himself had exiled, and if he hadn't already died from hunger or at the hands of strangers, he would hardly forgive his former friend. But Gunnar had no choice. "Send a messenger," he finally said. "Tell him, if he wants to live, if he wants to see another sunrise, it is time to put an end to our feud." No one objected. They all understood. If Gunnar had made this decision, it meant there was no other way. Below, among the waves, the black longships continued their relentless approach toward the shore. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the rocky shore. A heavy mist hung over the water, and only its faint shimmering betrayed the presence of life in this wild, forgotten land. Sigvard Shadowclaw sat by the flames, gripping a piece of dried meat in his hands. His face, hidden in the shadows, was covered with a thick beard, and the scars that crossed his cheek and brow made him look like a beast who had survived hundreds of battles. His light-colored eyes, cold as the winter sea, stared into the fire, though his thoughts were far away. Here, in exile, time moved slowly. He had long since lost track of how many winters had passed since the day Gunnar had betrayed him. Once they had been brothers in arms. They had stood side by side in battle, laughed together when their enemies fell beneath their blows. But all of that changed in an instant. That dark betrayal had cost Sigvard everything: his home, his status, his honor. He had been cast out like a rabid dog, forced to survive in the wilderness where each day could be his last. He had learned to live with it, learned to survive. The sound of footsteps made him tense. He didn't move, but his hand instinctively reached for the axe at his side. No one came here without a reason. From behind the trees, a man emerged. He was dressed in tattered wool, his shoulders weighed down by a wet traveling cloak that soaked up the damp night air. The man looked exhausted, but there was fear in his eyes. "Sigvard," he said, stopping a few paces from the fire. The exile didn't answer. He merely tilted his head, allowing the flames to cast their harsh light upon his stern face. "I've come with a message from Gunnar Iron Bear," the man continued. The name drew nothing but bitter laughter. Sigvard smiled coldly, clenching his fist. "Gunnar?" His voice was hoarse, as if worn down by years of anger. "I thought he had already rotted beneath his own throne. His settlement is under threat. Foreigners have come with war. He asks for help." Sigvard was silent for a long time. "And he thinks I'll forget everything for him?" Finally he spoke, his voice as sharp as an old blade. He said, "If you want to live, if you want to see the sunrise again, it's time to end our feud." Sigvard narrowed his eyes. The exile did not fear death, but he knew these words were not empty. If Gunnar himself had come to him, it meant that things were far worse than anyone had anticipated. "Let it be," Sigvard muttered, rising to his feet. "But let him not think that I have returned to save him." He took his axe, swinging it as though greeting an old friend. "I've returned for my own debt." The night swallowed the forest, and the mist spread like rivers, curling around each stone, each tree in this wild, forgotten part of the world. It felt as though everything around them had become part of the darkness, with only the fire crackling in the camp, reminding them of life. Sigvard's steps were heavy, yet rhythmic, like the strikes of a hammer against stone. He had long grown used to the cold, solitary existence. Lifting his head, he gazed up at the starry sky, at the very same stars that had once lit the way for him and Gunnar as they set off to battle together, side by side, without fear. But everything had changed, and everything was no longer as it had been. In this exile, Sigvard had lost track of how much time had passed. Days bled into one another, and the seasons changed, indifferent to his isolation. The memory of that betrayal, when Gunnar had cast him out, still burned like a brand in his chest. A once unbreakable bond of brotherhood had turned to ash, and that wound had never truly healed. Now, Gunnar needed him again. News reached Sigvard that the Iron Bear settlement was in grave danger. Foreign invaders were at their gates, and they had come with war in their eyes. Gunnar, on the brink of destruction, had sent for help. Even with their bitter enmity, Sigvard knew he could not remain indifferent. Yet the thought of returning to that world, to the man who had betrayed him, filled him with anger. But perhaps it was no longer about forgiveness. The situation had become more dire than the feud that had once torn them apart. Sigvard's hand gripped his axe as he set off toward the mountains. There, deep within the heart of the wild, lay a place he and Gunnar had once called home, a place where their swords had first met beneath a single star, a place where they had been brothers. But that was a lifetime ago, and now Sigvard walked alone, driven by a debt long unpaid. The road ahead was long, but there was no turning back. He knew one thing for certain: the world was on the brink of something darker than mere betrayal. This time, survival wasn't guaranteed, and whatever awaited him in the mountain passes was more than just the end of an old grudge. As dawn broke, Sigvard set his course. He had returned for vengeance, for answers, and perhaps, just perhaps, for some kind of reckoning with the man who had once been his closest ally. Under Sigvard's heavy boots, the dry snow crunched, resembling shattered crystals beneath his feet. Each step felt heavy, like treading through the deep remains of forgotten memories. The mountain pass was empty and silent, and the winds, piercing through the path, felt not just cold, but malevolent. Like old friends and enemies, there was no place for warmth in this world, just like there was no place for this wind among the others. It played its cruel game. And this road, which Sigvard was walking down with an unknown tension in his heart, was not just a physical journey, it was laced with the shadows of betrayal and the pain of the past. Passing through these forgotten lands, he felt the silence close in around him, like the lid of a long-forgotten coffin. Only the snow crunched beneath his feet, and his thoughts, like ghosts, struggled to move. He remembered, once this land had been home, where every road led back to kin, a homeland, a family, a clan. Once he and Gunnar had dreamed of their family's greatness together, walking side by side along the warrior's path. But the day he learned of Gunnar's betrayal, everything changed. This world shattered. Now these lands, remnants of former glory. Sigurd recalled the rise of their settlement, the days when wars and victories seemed like an inseparable part of their lives. And now these places looked empty and dead, like old memories that had long faded, but were still as painful as the day they were made. Why am I walking this path? Sigurd asked himself as his eyes followed the faint outlines of the pass merging with the horizon. He didn't want to dwell on those uncomfortable memories anymore. He had already realized that he couldn't return what he had lost. There was no bringing back the old Gunnar, the friend. All that had changed. And now, he was the enemy. But the messenger had come again. And though his words were cold and brief, they left an imprint on Sigvard's heart. Gunnar is waiting. Those few words were heavier than 1,000 promises. Gunnar, who had left him for dead. Gunnar, who had left him in the darkness of loneliness. How could that be? But now, as he looked to the horizon, he understood that the choice was no longer clear. Sigvard couldn't just turn back and return to his mountain cave, retreat into silence as he once did. There was a new threat. It was clear that the invaders who threatened Gunnar's lands were not just barbarians. They were people who couldn't be negotiated with. They brought war, they brought fire. And even if Gunnar was to blame, this enemy was not something small. It wasn't just about an old conflict anymore. This was a threat to everything left in this world. And if he left Gunnar to his own devices, they would all be claimed by the darkness that came from the west. Everything can't be left unanswered, Sigurd understood, and his face, still shadowed by the fire that once burned in his heart, now looked resolute. Sigurd lifted his gaze, and before him unfolded the mountains. These rocks, these valleys, they weren't just landforms, they weren't just mountains. They were part of the same world that he and Gunnar had once built together. And now, walking among these impenetrable walls, he felt the weight of this place. It was both home and hell. It was the place where every grain of sand reminded him of the brotherly betrayal. And yet, at the same time, it was a place that demanded he become strong. Was it worth continuing? The answer was simple, as was the essence of his decision. Gunnar was waiting, whether as an enemy or a friend, but he was waiting. And Sigurd moved forward. His steps grew surer, and in his heart he knew that this path was not just a journey to an old enemy. It was a journey to himself, a path to becoming what he was meant to be. And perhaps only now would he understand why war never ends, even when you don't want to fight it. Because war doesn't end with anyone. It simply waits for the one who comes. The wind continued to howl through the mountain peaks, but now it didn't matter as much. Winds would always be there, as would the snow and the darkness. But the war was here, and Sigurd was walking toward it. Each step Sigurd took this time felt even heavier than the last. The mountains around him no longer seemed like home. They had become a threat, impenetrable walls, watching him like old sentinels who had long forgotten their duty. And now, in this darkness, he continued his path, his heart pounding in rhythm with each step, as if he were not just walking through mountains, but through the very history that needed to be rewritten. The wind carried cold from the endless reaches of the land, its breath not only biting, but malevolent. It was like an old companion and an old enemy, both distant yet ever present. The howling wind seemed to echo with the shadows of forgotten promises, reminding Sigurd that this road was not one of simple journey, but one deeply entangled in the pain of betrayal and the burden of the past. The snow crunched underfoot, the silence around him pressing in like the lid of an old, forgotten tomb. Only the wind spoke to him now, a voice cold and impassive, reminding him that he was no longer simply crossing familiar lands. These lands had changed. They were no longer the home he remembered, where every path led to his kin, to brotherhood. This was a place of bitter memories and old wounds. "Why am I walking this path?" Sigvard asked himself, eyes fixed on the fading horizon ahead. He didn't want to linger on those uncomfortable thoughts any longer. He had already realized that he couldn't reclaim what he had lost. The past was a thing of ruin. There was no returning to the old Gunnar, the friend he had once known. That man was gone, replaced by an enemy. But the messenger had come again, the same way they always did, bringing brief, cold words. "Gunnar is waiting." Those few words weighed heavier than 1,000 promises. Gunnar, who had betrayed him. Gunnar, who had left him for dead. How could that be? How could someone who was once a brother become a foe so easily? But now, as Sigvard gazed at the horizon, he knew the choice was no longer simple. He could not just turn back, retreat to the cave in the mountains where he had been hiding for so long. There was a new threat. This was no longer a matter of personal betrayal. It was a matter of survival. The invaders who threatened Gunnar's lands were not just any raiders. They were a people who couldn't be reasoned with. They brought war. They brought fire. And even if Gunnar had wronged him, this new enemy was a threat that could not be ignored. It wasn't just about an old conflict anymore. It was about the future of their world. And if Sigvard left Gunnar to face it alone, they would all be consumed by the darkness coming from the west. Everything can't be left unanswered, Sigvard realized, his face still shadowed by the fire that once burned in his soul, now hardening with resolve. He lifted his gaze once again, and before him the mountains spread wide, vast and impenetrable. These were not just rocks and snow. They were the remnants of the world that he and Gunnar had once forged together. And now, standing among them, Sigvard could feel the weight of this land. It was home, and it was hell. It was the place where every stone and every gust of wind reminded him of betrayal. But it was also the place where he would face what was to come. Was it worth continuing this journey? The answer was simple, and it lay in the essence of his choice. Gunnar was waiting, whether as a friend or an enemy. But he was waiting, and Sigvard kept walking. His steps grew more determined, his mind clearer now than it had been in years. He understood that this path was no longer just about the past. It was about the future, a future shaped by the choices he made now. And perhaps only now would he understand why wars never truly end, even when one no longer wishes to fight them. Because wars don't end with anyone. They simply wait for the one who dares to face them. The wind continued to howl through the peaks, but it no longer mattered as much. Winds would always be there, as would the snow, the darkness. But the war was here, and Sigvard was walking toward it. The night had already covered the land, but the mist did not dissipate. Its dense veil lay over every stone, every blade of grass, like a silent witness to an unknown future. The wind had stilled, as if the world had held its breath, awaiting the most dangerous moment. The snow crunched under Sigvard's boots, but in the stillness, it felt almost too loud. There was no sound now but the faint hum of his thoughts, which echoed with doubt and determination. The battle was coming. He could feel it in the air, thick with tension, as though the earth itself was preparing for something far worse than a simple skirmish. Each step Sigvard took, each breath he drew in the cold night air, was filled with contemplation about what was to come. His mind was tortured by a harsh truth. He could not turn back now, not after everything that had happened between him and Gunnar. And would it even be wise to? Would it be worthy? This path, it was no longer just about personal vengeance. This was about the future. It was about the very soul of their people, the chance to protect what had been fought for by generations before them. And though reaching it seemed a daunting task, Sigvard did not falter. He would not retreat, never again. As time passed, the darkness began to lift, and in that moment, when he reached the summit, his eyes fell upon Gunnar's great camp. The light of many fires flickered, casting fleeting shadows as figures moved in the distance. There he was, Gunnar Iron Bear, the master of this merciless force. He was no ordinary warrior, no simple foe like the others Sigvard had known. Gunnar was legendary, a man whose name sent shivers through the land. His resilience was known to all. His ruthless resolve and the shadow of fear surrounding his name had made him a living legend. He was not just an enemy. He was the embodiment of every enemy they had ever faced. But was his heart as cold as his reputation? Was there any humanity left in him? This was one of the greatest mysteries Sigvard grappled with, and perhaps it was a question he was no longer sure he wanted an answer to. What mattered more was the war they were about to face, not just between them, but between their people and the forces that loomed on the horizon. Sigvard stood, looking over the camp that stretched out beneath the moonlit sky. The land was eerily still, as though it too held its breath. Gunnar's camp seemed so small in comparison to the battles yet to come. But Sigvard knew better than anyone that the real challenge had never been just about conquering an enemy. It was about facing the unknown that came with it. The invaders were no mere raiders. They were a force like nothing the North had ever seen. His mind raced back to that moment when Gunnar's betrayal was sealed, when Sigvard was left for dead in the depths of the winter storm. There had been no mercy. But would he ever be able to forgive him? Did he even want to? The winds began to howl once more, but Sigvard remained still, his thoughts moving faster than the storm itself. His gaze hardened, set not just on Gunnar, but on the future that lay ahead, a future tied to this very moment. "Are you ready, old friend?" he whispered, as though speaking not just to Gunnar, but to himself. Suddenly, distant cries echoed from the camp, the sound of battle, not the full-scale assault yet, but the beginning of something far more dire. This was no longer just about settling old scores. This was about survival. And Sigvard knew, deep down, that no matter what happened here tonight, the war would not end with them. It would extend beyond them, into something far darker than either of them had ever imagined. "Prepare yourself," Sigvard thought, lifting his gaze to meet the stars above, as if they alone might offer some semblance of answers in this tangled web of fate. The light from the distant fires flickered once more, signaling the approach of what was inevitable. Sigvard moved forward, not following a path, but creating one with each determined step he took. The night may have been dark, but he was prepared. He was walking toward what would come, ready for the battle, ready for the victory, or for the change that could shift the very course of history. Heroes no longer remained simply heroes. They became part of an eternal story, one that would never end until the final answer was found. Could a warrior's soul survive after he was forced to betray himself? Sigvard would find out, and he would do so, walking into the very heart of the storm. Ready. The night, which only hours ago had seemed like the shadow of a forgotten world, was now ablaze with the light from countless fires scattered across Gunnar's camp. But this light did not bring peace. It only illuminated faces twisted in reflection of the flames, creating masks that resembled monsters more than men. Here, in the midst of this chaos, this bloody dance, arose the greatest danger. Not just the enemy, but the enemy within themselves. Sigvard was not one to fear the darkness, but he understood that the darkness here in this camp was not natural. It came from the people, from their actions, from the way they threw their souls into battles without question. The fire that burned in the eyes of these warriors was not sacred. It was destructive. This fire could destroy everything in its path, leaving only ash behind. He stood behind a ridge, wrapped in the glow of the distant fires, but did not succumb to the temptation to charge straight into it. No, he waited. He waited for that moment when everything said and done would finally come to the bloody arena, when Gunnar would understand that nothing could save him from this. And he had to decide, would he betray them all for revenge, or find the strength within himself to change the course of his own fate. Meanwhile, in the heart of Gunnar's camp, the warriors were preparing for the great battle. Though the large assault had not yet come, their eyes glinted with passion, and between them already began the full chaos. Who would go to the front? Who would stay behind for defense? And who was ready for the risky missions given only to those who feared not death? Perhaps they did not yet know how this battle would end, but many already felt that this was no ordinary campaign. Gunnar stood among his men, watching them prepare for what was about to become the greatest test of their lives. And like Sigvard, he felt no fear. Within him burned cold resolve, but at the same time, he understood that this battle was not just about power and control, but whether it was worth leading his people to this moment. Was it really worth the price they would have to pay? Was his army ready for what awaited them? The enemy was close now. Everything was on the edge. There was no time for hesitation. The final details were being made. Gunnar's desperate goal was now in his hands, and even though deep within he had doubts, he knew that there was no turning back. At the same time, Sigvard looked over his own people. They too were ready for battle, but each one of them had their own story. They were all bound not just by a grand goal, but by an obligation too difficult to explain with mere words. They were a people who could not afford to lose, and that thought gave them strength. Before entering the battle that night, Sigvard once again reflected on everything he had left behind. This was not just a battle for his people. It was a battle for the truth, for the chance to reclaim what had been lost, and to find the answers to the questions that haunted his soul. As his sword screeched in his hand and his warriors began to form up for the defense, Sigvard felt a surge of energy rise within his chest. It was not rage, but boundless determination. He knew that this night would change everything. In this dark hour before the battle, on the brink of life and death, the two enemies once again faced each other's gaze. This was not just a glance. It was a contest of souls, each striving for victory. Sigvard and Gunnar were face to face once again, and this meeting would decide everything that mattered. Was this the end or the beginning of something new? There was no time for answers, only battle, only life or death. Sigvard stood at the front line, his body soaked in sweat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. The night was relentless. Everything around him seemed dark, as if the world itself had fallen into shadow, but the outlines of what remained beyond the light were all too clear. The defensive line of his soldiers, preparing for battle. They stood with shields raised and swords drawn, but their eyes were filled with fear. They all knew this night would test each of them to the limit. In the distance, amidst the darkness, a storm raged, but this was no ordinary storm. It was a tempest of winds carrying with them the shrieks of evil and the loud sounds of war drums that stirred the enemy's army to prepare for a savage assault. Every gust of wind, every clanging sound of a drum seemed torn between light and shadow, between life and death. This was the place where every warrior could fall in a heartbeat without understanding who or why they were facing. This is our chance, Sigvard thought, but his mind couldn't shake the unease. He felt something was wrong. The enemy was prepared, but were they? His heart beat in despair, because deep within he knew this battle would be decided not only by the strength of swords. It would depend on who could endure the pain and conquer their own fears. Far off on the other side of the field stood Gunnar. His gaze spoke volumes. One could see that he too felt it. There was cold determination in his eyes, yet also the understanding that this battle was more than just strategy. War was about souls. War changes people. Sigvard and Gunnar were not merely enemies on the battlefield. They were like two opposing poles, pulling each other, creating an explosive force that could change the world. Both of them truly believed in what they were doing, but both understood. Only one would prevail, the one who could break the spirit of the other. The battle was not just for land or gold. It was for the future of their people, for the ideas they could not let go. And now, when the worst was becoming evident, when the storm was gathering strength, and the armies began to move toward each other, the war signals echoed through the night. The swords met, and blood spilled across the ground. The cries of warriors charging toward one another blended with the thunderous noise of the battle as human bodies fell to the earth, merging with its dark shadows. Yet, this was only the first wave. The greatest trials lay ahead. The battle was relentless. The literature of the Viking era depicts these scenes not just as bloodshed, but as a trial of the human soul. The fight was not only external, but internal. Sigvard felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. He knew this was not just a battle for survival. It was a battle to see who could maintain their sense of self amidst the chaos, the blood, and the fire. Gunnar did not fall behind, but with each passing moment, his eyes grew darker. He too began to feel that despite all his strength and influence, his morals were starting to rot. Perhaps what he was doing was no longer noble? Perhaps he had become part of the monster he once despised? These questions might have gone unanswered were it not for this very moment, the moment of meeting his own reflection in battle. The storm raged on, and the fight grew more bloody. Sigvard and Gunnar were now at the very center of it. Each of them understood. Their final confrontation was approaching, and only one would walk away from this field alive. But how would this final confrontation unfold? How would it end? No one could say, but there was one certainty. Fire and ice would meet this evening, and only one would remain. The battle had already raged for hours. The lines were nearly broken, and both armies were enduring some of the fiercest moments of their history. The earth was red with blood, and the air thick with the scent of iron, sweat, and fear. All the warriors, whether clad in scale mail or simple leather tunics, wore the same expression, their eyes ruthless and filled with calculated resolve. They killed or died. But what was important was not just the fight for land or riches. This battle was for their future, for the faith they carried in their hearts. Sigvard took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill his lungs, pushing through pain and fatigue, but every step he took was steady and sure. Enemies stood before him, and he left no room for pity or hesitation. Every swing of his sword was swift and powerful, the transition between life and death a fleeting moment. Enemies fell like logs, breaking from the force of his strikes, but Sigvard knew that this was only a temporary success. Ahead still stood Gunnar, the Jarl, who showed no sign of retreat. Sigvard could see him in the fog of battle, standing on top of a hill, his great sword raised high. His silhouette appeared like a statue, unyielding, watching his enemies like a great bear ready to strike. Gunnar's eyes held no light, no reflection of the warriors he led. There was only darkness in them, a darkness that could swallow everything around him. They all knew that the war was merely a reflection of a greater struggle. The enmity between Sigvard and Gunnar was not just a conflict between two nations or a desire for land. It was a clash of two souls, two worldviews, two ideals. Sigvard believed in honor, while Gunnar believed in power. Sigvard saw war as a means for change, for justice, while Gunnar saw strength as the foundation of order. They were like opposing poles, both of them central to the very essence of existence. But the greatest battle had not yet begun on the field. It was beginning in the shadows, as the armies of both sides, like one single entity, moved through the chaos and uncertainty. Sigvard could not shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. He lifted his gaze and saw the mist, which was slowly but relentlessly engulfing the battlefield. This was no ordinary fog. It was a black omen, growing larger with each step, moving towards him with terrifying speed. "Gunnar!" Sigvard shouted through the clamor of the battle, his voice cutting through the smoke and the cries of warriors. But this was not merely a call for his enemy. Sigurd knew these words were not a warning. It was a challenge born from the depths of his heart, a desire to triumph in this duel, even if that victory meant the end for one of them. But Gunnar remained still. He did not react to the signals, nor did he acknowledge the challenge. He was lost in deep thought, his mind ensnared in darkness. It seemed that this was no longer just a war between two men. It was something greater, a fight for their own ideas, for the forces that drove them both forward. And in that moment, as the earth itself seemed to crumble beneath their feet and the best warriors from both sides fell to the ground, Sigurd felt something shift. No longer was there honor, nor strength, nor faith in victory. It had become a question of who would remain alive amidst all these dark forces, and more importantly, who among them would become the master of those dark forces. Perhaps not Gunnar, perhaps not Sigurd. Perhaps there was someone else entirely, someone watching them from the darkest corners of this merciless battle. But one thing was clear: whoever emerged victorious, this battle would change everything. Above all the other sounds of battle, above the cries of the mortally wounded and the clash of swords, there was one sound that rose above all, a deep rumble that shook the earth, as if the very land itself began to tremble under some invisible force. Sigvard, though deeply immersed in the chaos of combat, suddenly stopped. He raised his head and surveyed the field. Everything around him continued to spiral into the hellish swirl of war, but this sound was too important to ignore. He saw it then, emerging from the fog that had been enveloping the battlefield. A figure. It was tall and imposing, its silhouette barely visible through the darkness, as though the night itself had come alive. The soldiers around him were too absorbed in the fight to notice, but Sigvard couldn't shake the feeling that this shadow was something far more than just a warrior. Its form was unnatural, moving like an expanding cloud, defying the very nature of the world. With every step, the shadow drew closer, and when it crossed the boundary of the battle, it became clear. This was no mere man. It looked like some beast, or perhaps it was death itself, deciding to take physical form on this earth. The warmth of its presence seemed to vanish from the air, and it felt as if the very warriors around him had stopped breathing, as if awaiting some terrible fate that was about to descend upon them. Gunnar, still standing atop the hill, took notice of this approaching figure, his hand slowly placing his sword on the ground. He did not seem afraid, but his face reflected the same uneasy feeling that was spreading among those around him. He knew this shadow was something more than just a monster. It was a sign that something incredible was about to happen in the battle. Sigvard took a few steps forward, and as the dark figure came closer, he was able to see it in more detail. It was an old warrior, clad in dark armor, a hood covering much of his face. His eyes burned red like embers, and his presence was overwhelming, as if the very darkness itself was emanating from him. Who are you?" Sigvard shouted, his voice barely cutting through the noise of battle. "I am the one you seek, Sigvard," came the reply, a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of a cavern. It held no human warmth, no trace of life. It was something darker, something that did not belong to this world. Sigvard couldn't shake the words from his mind. He realized this figure wasn't just a warrior, but something that stood between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. "Have you come to take me?" Sigvard asked, a heavy question hanging in the air. "Not you," the dark figure answered. "I have come for the one who led you here. Your battle is not yet over, but I am its end. I have not come to help you. I have come to allow you both to understand that none of you will leave alive." Darkness began to envelop the field. The earth itself began to shake, and the sky above them changed color, turning as black as the night itself. The invisible winds tangled in hair, armor, and the hearts of the warriors, and Sigvard's heart pounded heavily, like a drum. And then, Just as it seemed the final moment of the battle had come, with all waiting for their fate to be sealed, more figures emerged from the shadows. People with dark, red eyes. They came with the Dark Warrior. These were no ordinary soldiers. These were the ones who had burned their souls for power and for their worldly desires. They were those who, like Gunnar, sought power, but not for empires, rather for the very essence of existence itself. Now the battle had taken a new turn. Everyone was but a player on someone else's field. The battle had ceased, but the war was far from over. The shadows that had descended upon the field did not fade as easily as they had come. Instead, they grew, spreading like a suffocating mist that wrapped around the very hearts of the remaining warriors. Those who had been fighting for their lives now found themselves fighting not only against flesh and blood, but against the very essence of something ancient and malevolent. Sigvard's sword felt heavier in his hand as he faced the Dark Warrior, the one who had come to end this conflict in a way that none of them had anticipated. But even in the face of death itself, Sigvard felt the fire of his ancestors burning within him. He was not about to let his people fall into the hands of the darkness without a fight. "You speak of death, but you have no power over those who refuse to bow," Sigvard said, his voice steady despite the unease that rattled his soul. The Dark Warrior's red eyes flickered, a faint smirk crossing his shadowed face. "You speak of defiance, but all who defy the darkness meet their end. You, like all before you, will fall into the abyss of oblivion." Sigvard's grip tightened on his sword, his knuckles whitening. "We may fall, but we will never be forgotten." Before the Dark Warrior could respond, a voice rang out across the battlefield, carrying with it a thunderous power. "It is not the time for death, not yet." Gunnar, the mighty Jarl of the Iron Bear, emerged from the mist that had swallowed the battlefield. His armor glinted under the dull red sky, his presence commanding the attention of every soul within the fog. He was no longer the warrior who had once fought for honor and power alone. Something within him had shifted. Something ancient and primal had been awakened by the arrival of the shadow. He stepped forward, his sword drawn, eyes locked with the dark figure. "You are not welcome here," Gunnar growled, his voice laced with defiance. "You may think yourself a herald of death, but this is not your land to claim." The dark figure's eyes narrowed, his shadowy form flickering as if the darkness itself had a mind of its own. "You dare oppose me, Gunnar of the Iron Bear? You who have walked the path of bloodshed and power?" Gunnar's voice was cold as ice. "I am no servant of death. I will not bow to what has already claimed my soul. The lives of my people are worth more than any promise of eternal rest." For a moment, the two figures stood locked in a silent struggle, an invisible force swirling between them. Sigvard could feel the weight of their words, the very air around them thick with the power of their wills. It was in that moment that Sigvard understood the truth of this battle. It was not just a war for survival. It was a war for the very soul of their people. It was a battle to retain the light, to fight back against the darkness that sought to consume everything. He knew that the outcome of this battle would echo through time itself. Without warning, Gunnar lunged forward, his mighty sword slashing through the air with the power of a storm. The Dark Warrior moved to counter, but the force of Gunnar's attack shattered the stillness. Their blades clashed with a resounding crash that seemed to shake the heavens themselves. The ground beneath them cracked, the earth itself reacting to the fury of their strikes. But the shadow was relentless. It lashed out, its dark tendrils reaching for Gunnar, wrapping around his body like chains of despair. The Jarl grunted in defiance, pushing through the darkness, his eyes burning with the fury of 1,000 storms. Sigvard knew that this was a fight they could not afford to lose. The future of their world depended on it. With a fierce cry, Sigvard joined the battle, charging into the fray with his sword raised high. Together with Gunnar, they fought as one, their blades cutting through the shadow that had come to claim them. Each strike was filled with the weight of their ancestors' spirits, each blow a testament to the strength of their people. But the dark warrior, despite their combined might, was unyielding. He seemed to draw strength from the very shadows that surrounded them, his form ever-changing, an embodiment of the darkness itself. As the battle raged on, it became clear to Sigvard and Gunnar that this was no ordinary foe. They were fighting not just for survival, but for the soul of their people. And in the heart of the storm, they would have to make a choice. The dark warrior's voice rang out one final time, a chilling promise that echoed in the silence of the battle. Your resistance will crumble, and your people will fall. The darkness will consume all. But in that moment, Sigvard and Gunnar stood tall. They knew that no matter how dark the night became, no matter how powerful the shadows seemed, they would never surrender. For the fire of their ancestors burned brightly within them, and as long as they drew breath, the light would never be extinguished. And so, in the final clash, the shadows were driven back. The darkness that had threatened to swallow them was forced to retreat, if only for a time. The warriors of the north stood victorious, but they knew that the war was far from over. The shadow had not been vanquished, only pushed into the depths, waiting for the day it would rise again. But for now they had won, and in the heart of the northern lands, the spirit of the Vikings would live on, unbroken, their vows to each other and to their people unyielding, no matter what darkness may come. The final vow had been made, and the battle would continue.